Okay, well today we have the honor of having someone from ODOT to go ahead and share with us right off the presses the decision that was made yesterday as to what areas are being recommended for tolling. Basically, the theme of it is called the Portland Metro Area Value Pricing Feasibility Analysis. And they did look at various scenarios involving I-5 and I-205. The Abernathy Bridge is one of those on the I-205 tolling scenario. But I'm going to go ahead and let you share with everybody the latest and the greatest. So we thank you for coming.
I'm going to try to keep enjoying my cup of coffee, but it's not very full, so I think I can put it. This is sloped. See, it's a sloped surface. It's not intended for continuing to drink your beverage. I have fewer brain cells today than I did when I started this project about 8 months ago. So I'm going to miss them, but I'm going to do the best I can today to fill you in on what the process has been and where we're going. How many folks here have seen me or one of my colleagues give a presentation about this project in the last few months? I know some folks over there have. Did any of you want to give this presentation instead? I actually really love this project. My name is Judith Gray, and I've been working in transportation in this region for over 20 years. And I've been training for this project for all of that time, it turns out. I didn't know I was training for it. I got a master's degree in industrial engineering and economics back in 1997 with an emphasis in transportation. And at that time I said, I really want to do congestion pricing. And I asked the professors how I could do congestion pricing for my thesis. And they said, don't even bother, that's political, that's not economics. So I did other things. I worked as a consultant with Kittleson and Associates for several years. I did a little bit of work with Tony back in a previous realm. Then I went to the city of Tigard and was there for 5 years, and that was my introduction to working in the public sector. I worked for the city of Portland for a few years as their planning and policy manager. And when congestion pricing came up in the legislature, I thought they were kidding, and it was real, and so I moved over to ODOT. I applied for this position so I could be a part of this. And the reason is not just academics and curiosity. It is because congestion pricing is a very promising tool. It is used in many other places. It's probably used by some of you in your businesses in other ways. You know, we try to adjust pricing to get the most out of the limited supply of whatever it is we have. That's the essence of it. But it's not easy. So we have had a lot of work to do. Let me try that. Today is kind of anticlimactic. Yesterday was the last meeting of the Policy Advisory Committee, and so I went ahead and I just passed out this one article. This was from, the Tribune. You guys might get a version of this. It's a pretty good article. The headline is misleading, but that's still pretty good because the headline says Portland tolls price first, add capacity later, and that we don't really know. That's not really determined, but that's a headline. But the substance of the report's pretty good. The Oregonian had a pretty good report today. And when you're doing a controversial topic, that's a really big hurdle, is if you can get some reasonably good media representation of what you're doing. Not necessarily to make it all favorable, but at least, in the facts. So we feel good about that, and I was happy to share that with you. And I'm also sharing with you this flyer for some public comment opportunities, because even though the advisory committee made an important decision yesterday, we're not finished. We have more to do, and coming up will be a special meeting of the Oregon Transportation Commission which is really primarily about getting public comment, providing an opportunity for public comment on this project. So the only topic will be the Policy Advisory Committee recommendation, and then opportunity for public comment. So please consider coming or sharing this information with your constituents or your colleagues, as it may be. That's a long intro for me. I'll try to pick up the pace now. This is the title of the project. This was the project that I was hired to do. The Portland Metro Area Value Pricing Feasibility Analysis. Those are precisely chosen words. I'll tell you a little bit more. It comes out, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about where it came from. This came from legislative direction in House Bill 2017. And then I'll tell you about what that means, what it means with the Federal Highway Administration, and then how the Oregon Transportation Commission has taken on this task. I'll review quickly the different concepts that the Policy Advisory Committee considered. And then, but I'm not going to stick with that too long because they've already made their recommendation about what should move forward. So I'll try to get back into that. And then kind of what that recommendation means. Because there was nobody on the committee who was even asked to say, yeah, ODOT, go ahead, flip that switch and let's start tolling. Because there's quite a bit more work to do. But we did need to get to a point where we would say, what are the projects that are promising? What are the projects that might be worthwhile? And then as you go forward, we need to look at these different issues. What would make it really successful? And how do we make sure we're meeting the objectives for this area? For the legislature, the Oregon Transportation Commission, and the local communities. So referring back, HB 2017, did you guys have a presentation here about that transportation package last year? It was a big one. It included one of my bosses, I have many bosses, one of them likes to refer to this as the all of the above approach. Identified major freeway projects to do, did some non-freeway freight projects on marine and rail, committed ongoing revenue for active transportation projects, committed ongoing revenue for transit operations. Those have never been done. There were a few policy pieces, and one of them was congestion pricing. So this, I used to have a bigger slide that really does a better job of conveying what a massive transportation undertaking the legislature took in their last session. It generated a new $5.3 billion in revenue, so we are all paying that now with increased gas taxes, title fees, there's a new employee tax. So there's a lot of revenue that sometimes we don't notice it as much because it's a little bit. And it's a little, gas prices go up and down all the time, so we may not even notice that incremental change. But this is new investment. So that's one reason the way I look at this, and I asked one legislator if I could say this, that they dedicated new revenue for transportation, but they also said you've got to make the most of it. And that's what I think is the opportunity with congestion pricing. She said, yes, you can say that. I just asked the one. So in House Bill 2017, the legislature directed the Oregon Transportation Commission to consider or to seek Federal Highway Administration approval for implementing value pricing on I-5 and I-205 in this Portland metro region. And that if it is approved by Federal Highway Administration, it must be done. In between those two bullet points, there's several years of process, but it really wasn't go consider to do it, but it was go do it. Federal Highway Administration has policy guidance on how that's done, and that's why the directive was put that way. I don't know if you guys can see the slide, but let me know if you need me to read something. So I think it's probably a good idea to let me get through at least a bunch of it, but maybe I'll stop, or else we won't get there, I'm pretty sure. So value pricing. The term value pricing is kind of synonymous with congestion pricing. It's similar to tolling, but tolling is like the umbrella phrase that means the user fee attached to the driver while driving on a roadway. Whereas traditionally tolling has been used solely for the purpose of generating revenue to pay for that infrastructure. Value pricing is it's the name of a federal program, but it really is the same as congestion pricing, means in particular that the price varies, that it fluctuates, that it's highest during the highest demand period, and then it's lowest during the lower periods. Maybe there isn't even a fee at all during really low periods, because you are trying to manage congestion. And in fact, it would be measured, the success would be measured not by how much money you generate, but by whether you're able to maintain good flow of the traffic, And I think that there's even a particular standard we would probably be looking at, like 90% of the time you have to be operating at 45 miles an hour or better. That's probably not a precise standard, but it's that sort of thing. That's what success means. In addition to that big House Bill 2017, the legislature also passed a budget, and it was 2 years. So this is not exactly binding, but it is really very instructive about a priority, because this was a conversation about revenue. And one of the things they said was that the I-205 Stafford Road to Abernethy Bridge bottleneck is a priority. Use value pricing revenue to pay for that construction. And then if it's not sufficient, we have to report back. So a big question to us is this a viable source of funding for the reconstruction of the Abernethy Bridge with the widening as well as the third lane added for that whole section? And I imagine that's something that you guys are pretty familiar with. So we had two objectives in going forward. One was to use a tool, find a tool to manage traffic flow. The other one was to identify the viability of this as a funding strategy. There is an overlap because it would be great if we could find a way for them to do both things. It's certainly possible. It's not always that way, but I really wanted to put a little happy face there, but that seems like that wouldn't be very professional. So I'm just going to tell you that instead. That would be a happy face if we could do both things. So with that, the reason Federal Highway Administration, because these are federally funded freeways, they prohibit tolling. That's why you have to go to them to get permission. They prohibit it with some specific exceptions. And so as we've been going through this process, we're figuring out which one would we use? What is the argument we're making? What is the policy program that we would be looking to find out what's the process, who's involved, how do you measure success, what are the reporting requirements, things like that. Because that's what we find when we dig into policy documents, we find things like that. So there's one that's for project funding, Section 129, general tolling. So if you're using your money, if you're trying to raise money just to do a project, it's got a little bit more of a straightforward process. It's still multi-steps. But then there are congestion management. There are two different federal policy programs for congestion management that we might consider. And one of them is if you convert an existing HOV lane, so HOV lanes are high occupancy vehicle, carpool lanes. If you convert the use of a carpool lane to allow also vehicles that pay a toll, that would be one federal program that is allowed. And then the other one is this value pricing pilot program. And so I wasn't involved in the legislative process, but I speculate that that's the reason that this got this name, value pricing, is because they were aware that this would be the likely federal policy program that we would probably want to look at. A lot of times people think we're just whitewashing it by calling it value pricing. So I tell you that, well, we're not. It's just, that's the name of the federal program, value pricing. So that's the legislative direction. And with that, I want to tell you what the OTC did. I'm thinking about you because I don't want to go too far, but I'm going to talk about how they set up the process, and then before I get into technical findings, I'll ask for questions then. Is that all right? Okay. So the Oregon Transportation Commission now has this new task, this new obligation, along with a whole lot of revenue. So this was like they did not, I heard somebody say, we love House Bill 2017. Unfortunately, it didn't add any more hours to the day. It's been quite a lot to do. So what the OTC first did was establish a policy advisory committee to represent diverse interests, to give them a recommendation of where along those two corridors and what kind of value pricing would be the right way to go. So 4 counties, including Clark County, were represented. Commissioner Savas was representative for Clackamas County. Portland Business Alliance, Oregon Trucking Association, Verity, and Opal Environmental Justice of Oregon. So I'm just naming a few. We have some representation from business, environmental justice, cities, etc. The co-chairs of the committee were 2 of the Oregon Transportation Commissioners, Sean O'Halloran and Alonzo Simpson, and they were present at all of the meetings, and so that's helpful because not only are they going to receive a recommendation, but they've been hearing all of the discussions throughout. In the charter, which I consider this is the request of the OTC to the Policy Advisory Committee. So there's like a 6-page document that kind of lays out, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it. What we need from you is this. The intention of the OTC is to look for projects that can manage congestion and also look for a way to finance bottlenecks. We didn't say I-205 here, but that's what that meant. I mean, it could be another, but really they were thinking about I-205. So that gets back to those 2 circles with the happy place in the middle. So 2 objectives that we can think about, but many other factors to consider, and these are priority factors the OTC identified. Many of you are probably already thinking about diversion, but in general, traffic operations and whether or not it's improving, it has to work. What is the diversion? Is there an adequate transit system in place or other alternatives? What's the public input, the revenue, the cost, the kinds of factors that they wanted the PAC, the Policy Advisory Committee, to be thinking about when they advanced their recommendation. And then finally, these are their priority recommendations. At the end of this process, we would have opinions on a lot of different things we would answer. We would probably open up many new questions than we would answers, which is often the case in the beginning of a complex project. But in this case, the priority was where and what type of congestion pricing should we be looking at, and what are the priority mitigation strategies to address the impacts on the surrounding communities and impacts to environmental justice and low-income communities. So that was the priority charge, and my job as a project manager was to support the PAC with consideration of those 10 factors to inform them in making this kind of a recommendation. So we had 6 meetings starting in November. I started my job in October, first meeting in November, and the beginning stage was very much an educational stage. While we all learned in Oregon, even those of us who've been doing this decades, haven't done a congestion pricing project because we haven't had one. And also we had an excellent consultant team, but they needed to learn more about this region. They needed to learn about the traffic conditions, the geometrics of our existing freeway, the politics, the stakeholder values, the community. So we really took that time for this shared learning stage. And then came back and the recommendation stage, the time for the policy advisory committees to really figure out what are the choices that we're making here, what is our recommendation going to be. That was in a course of 3 meetings in April, May, and June, the last one being yesterday. So I'll walk you through a little bit more of that. Let's see. Okay, with that, you had a question?
My question has to do with final authority. Is it the Federal Department of Transportation that if they approve whatever recommendation that comes out of your group, if they approve that, does that mean it's approved? There's no other approvals that are necessary?
Well, the Oregon Transportation, this is a tricky question, and I'm only going to answer it about 80% right. So I'm just going to try to be silent on because I'm still learning everything as we go. But I can tell you this much. Federal Highway Administration does have to give us approval based on those tolling programs. And in the state of Oregon, the Oregon Transportation Commission is the tolling authority. So in some ways, Oregon has the authority to do tolling under certain guidelines. But I think what I'm coming to understand now and what's going to be coming out over the next several years is, well, I'll know a lot more in 2 months. But right now, it's really a matter of working with Federal Highway Administration to understand what does that mean in those policy programs, because there will be requirements under the National Environmental Protection Act to make sure that we're addressing environmental impacts and impacts on different communities and that we're doing collaboration with different groups. So it's kind of like, it's a little bit vague, right? And I'll just say that I think it's super clear that the OTC is the tolling authority for Oregon. It's also super clear that the Federal Highway Administration administers the freeway, oversees ODOT's role. So both of those have to move forward.
What about voters?
It does not require a vote. Are there any other questions about where we are right now before I get into the concepts? Ooh, yes.
Just clarify the membership and the makeup and where they are in the state and how that committee is kind of made up.
The OTC is 5 members appointed by the governor, confirmed by the Senate. I'm sure. You probably know this, but I'm sure there are people here who know this. But anybody can correct me if I'm wrong about this. But there are 5 members. One is brand new. I haven't met yet. But there's Tammy Bainey is from Bend, and she is the chair. Bob Van Brocklin is a new member within the past few months. He's out of Portland. Sean O'Halloran, and he's with the firm Stoll Reeves, I think, one of the big law firms. Sean O'Halloran is with Nike, and Alonzo Simpson is the owner of the Rose City trash pickup. So those were the 2 co-chairs of the committee. And then there's a new member, and don't tell anybody, I can't remember his name, he's one of my bosses, but are you recording this for, it's gonna be, I'm sure you are, it's okay. We have a new member who is a port commissioner from Coos Bay, maybe, or somewhere along the coast, and so he's a new member that I haven't met yet. That's all I can tell you about that. The governor does. So we'll go back. When we come back to these topics, I know these topics really well. And the other questions about some of the politics and the process about that are things I'm going to know really well, really soon. There are two basic ways to price the freeway. You know, when you think about congestion pricing, it actually can be a cordon price, which they have in London, where they just draw a circle around the city, and if you enter the city, you pay the price. That's what London has. Parking, paid parking is a kind of congestion pricing because it typically varies with the busiest times of day. And in fact, under that value pricing pilot program, this is a piece of trivia you don't need, but it used to be a funding program, and they actually gave a grant of around $40 million to the city of San Francisco to develop a value pricing approach to their downtown parking spaces. So that's kind of cool. So anyway, but there are two basic tools for freeways. One of them is roadway or bridge tolling, which just basically means you're pricing all of the lanes. And then the other one is managed or priced lanes. So you do pricing a lane operating right next to unpriced lanes. Those are the basic building blocks. So with that, we did this approach where we had a lot to learn. We all had a lot to learn, and so we did an approach called the bookends and combinations, the building blocks and the bookends, where we said, let's take those different tools, apply them throughout the whole system, and see what does it happen? What are the geometric constraints? Where are they most effective? You know, just more for study than for viability. But in the course of that, we learned a few key things that I want to share with you that really inform where we ended up. So first of all, it turns out, if you operate a priced lane next to unpriced lanes, you have to have at least 3 lanes to do it. Because for the freeway, if you were to price one lane and then have one unpriced lane operating next to it, you really don't have a freeway anymore. You have like a rural highway, 1 lane each. So we have to only look at places where there are at least 3 lanes. This entire system is at least 3 lanes, except for the section on I-205 near here, and also sections of the Rose Quarter, of I-5 through the Rose Quarter, that are only 2 through lanes. So it doesn't count if it's auxiliary lanes for people merging on and off. So I knew that was a meaningful constraint. Freight is typically prohibited from using, first of all, the leftmost lane in the state of Oregon, but it turns out that in most states where they have priced lane concepts, freight doesn't get to use them. And so unless you've done it in such a way that the general purpose lanes are also operating better, which can be the case, but that was a real issue for our freight representatives, which I would have expected to be the case. And I do know that for the whole statewide legislature, when they gave this direction, you know, the improvements for freight moving through this region was a statewide priority. It's also limited revenue, and so it can be an effective way to manage the flow of traffic, but there needs to be awareness that the revenue that would be generated would be very limited. First of all, you'd want to make sure it pays for itself, or at least Oregon would want to make sure it pays for itself. But in terms of additional revenue to pay for mitigations or the project itself, very limited. And then in terms of equity, and equity is something we're going to be having to talk a lot about because it's easy to think about equity just in terms of added out-of-pocket cost. Now I'm paying a little bit out of my pocket every day, and that's a real concern. However, there are other ways to look at it too. One of the things we really want to do is to make sure that if we have a congestion pricing program that improves traffic conditions, that everybody benefits. It's not just there for people who can pay more. And so one of the dynamics that happens is that, yes, with an unpriced lane, you do have that unpriced option, so you maintain that same condition about the out-of-pocket costs. But it means that if you want to benefit, if you need to get home in time, if you need to go relieve the shift, if you're, depending on your own value of time for that particular trip, it's a higher amount per trip with a single lane concept. That just tends to be the case because you're asking one lane to do a bigger job instead of distributing it over the rest. So these are things that we learned early on that kind of made me think what might be coming in some areas. For the priced roadway, it is the most effective just because you are pricing the entirety of it. It does have the highest revenue potential. One of the things that came up, it's not here, but the consultants had reported that you would tend to see, well, actually, I'm jumping ahead. I have to hold that and I'll wait till I get to another slide. But it has to do with diversion. The equity trade-off here, though, that's important is that even though you lose that unpriced option, you kind of lower the cost of participating in the benefit. So it doesn't make one the obvious better choice. It's just that it needs to be thought about with some of that nuance, I think. So those are just key findings from early on in the process. With that, we spent those last few meetings developing the recommendation with these 5 concepts. So I think I'm going to try to go through kind of quickly because, oh, hey, thank you. So these are the 5, and so if you can see them, where you see the green line, those are single lane concepts, and where you see the orange, those are roadways. Okay, so all of the lanes would be priced. Let me walk through them like this. First of all, and these are A through E. And we have to stop talking about them A through E now that we're moving on, but for this, I'll just say it like that. Concept A was where we have that single HOV lane on I-5, currently close as you approach Vancouver. This concept was, well, should we consider converting that to a toll lane, an HOT lane, and then running a parallel southbound for the same section? So that was one concept that we looked at. It didn't have a lot of effect. So it was kind of, didn't have a lot of positive effect. It didn't have a lot of negative effect. It really didn't degrade conditions in this first run analysis. And I should say this first run analysis is very much an indicator. It's not at design level. It's what's viable, what's possible, what might we expect to see that is promising, or if we see concerns, are those things that can be addressed in a later phase. So these are indicator type analysis, but they're very useful. So concept A, minimal benefit, limited diversion, very limited revenue also, limited, because it's a very short section. It does maintain those unpriced lanes, and so there would be that, and that was desirable. But I can say that the folks to the north of the river, nobody championed this one. There was nobody that was saying, oh, this one is great, at the Policy Advisory Committee. So there wasn't a great technical reason, and then there wasn't anybody who really thought it was the most valuable. So that one went away. Concept B is I-5, and this is one of the ones that if you've read your newspaper article that we passed out, this is one that has been advanced has been recommended to the OTC that they advance for further analysis. Concept B is one that is the roadway pricing through the Rose Quarter. The concept at this stage shows it going from Going Street at the northern end down to Multnomah at the southern end. The reason I'm not surprised to see this is because the Rose Quarter area was identified as the priority congestion problem for the state. And when we learned that you can't operate a priced lane through that whole area or through the real bottleneck because it's only 2 lanes, I imagined we would advance something that had a priced roadway here. So this one also showed a lot of benefit in the congestion, relatively modest diversion, although it's going to be, we know that when we go forward, these are going to be critical issues that we dive into a lot more deeply. But it is an area that has a network of both roadway alternatives and transit alternatives, bike ped facilities. So there are opportunities for that. Concept C is the one that was considered that would just price all of it. And I was actually surprised when I saw the consultant present this one, but they just said, it really shows what the potential implications could be if you just had a more broad tolling environment. And we actually had a lot of interest in this, and I've done presentations in all 4 of the counties, and I have heard a lot of interest in really going broad with congestion pricing throughout the whole region, and I was surprised. But it actually did make it into the recommendation as something to consider as a future phase, with a lot more planning and analysis, including the rest of the freeway system. So I'm doing this, I'm telling you guys all the spoiler alerts right now because they took the action yesterday. But so this one was advanced, the PAC recommended, yes, consider this for a future vision in conjunction with more analysis of the other freeways and also planning for growth. So, concept D, we looked at the priced lane, adding that 3rd lane on I-205. You guys probably are really aware of that bottleneck, and also that bridge project. similar to concept A, the other single lane pricing, it had marginal impact. The thing is, right now, and I'm just going to make up some numbers, but so a freeway lane is designed to handle probably about 1,800 to 2,000 vehicles per hour. So but that's the maximum. And you might be getting something like, I'm totally making this up, but I did do traffic for a long time, so I'm looking at Tony, maybe you remember, but like 1,700 an hour, during a congested, you're going to start really noticing the congestion. If you've got 2 lanes and you're trying to get 3,500 vehicles through there, you're going to really be feeling that congestion. When you add another lane, you've added 50% more capacity. You only need to peel off a few of those vehicles in order to really experience the difference. You don't, so for that, perhaps more than you needed. What you would expect to see if you put in a 3rd lane and put in a toll is you would have like 5% of the cars go there because everybody else would just be flowing. So you wouldn't really generate much revenue at all. You might have a 25-cent toll, which would be great in terms of the out-of-pocket cost, but it doesn't pay for the project. And remember back when I showed you those 2 circles, managed congestion, fund infrastructure, and those 2 intentions out of the Oregon Transportation Commission and that budget note. So the word we got back that we understood was that this would not be a revenue strategy. It could possibly help you get the most out of that 3rd lane, but it would not pay for the construction. So that 3rd lane still doesn't exist. Does that make sense? So, it's like it was not a bad project or anything like that. It's not funded. So we asked the consultant to do some analysis and tell us if we were to have a toll at the bridge, the Abernethy Bridge, and this was just an idea to find out, is there a funding strategy with using tolling, perhaps with a toll at the bridge? It was tested using variable pricing still, so the highest amount during the peak period, and then ramping down to 0 toll overnight, that kind of thing. So it can show some real benefits. And the answer to the real question, though, is it could, and this was such a preliminary type of analysis. This was really the kind of analysis where you make a bunch of assumptions that seem reasonable, and you say, what would you get with these reasonable assumptions? And the answer back was, we think that this kind of a tolling treatment could generate enough to pay for the bridge reconstruction and the majority of those added lane construction. So it just needs to be looked at more, but it is somewhat promising. Like I honestly didn't know. Are they going to come back and say, we think you could pay for 10% of the project, or we think you could pay for 110% of the project? I just didn't know. And they came back with something like 70 to 100. But
just a quick question.
Yep.
I know in a lot of the, use the microphone. I know in a lot of the articles that I've read, the considered total amount was $3.50.
that was one, yes. So the assumed toll amount that was used for this analysis was a peak toll of $3.50, and then I can't remember what, there were 2 other levels down to like $1 or $1.25, and then no toll from 11 o'clock at night. So those were the assumptions that were used, but they showed that it could work. And so what that said was, look closer at this one. And this one was then advanced for further consideration. So I want to talk to you more about, when we identified these, then you start finding more issues. And so, like, one of the things we know, we've had several discussions with Clackamas County staff, including we just got a conference call together with the consultants in Clackamas County transportation staff to get to clarify that if this is looked at as a funding strategy, then there have to be a lot of things that are still open. Like, well, how would you actually design it? If you're trying to fund this project, you don't want to just put a line across the bridge, because that just makes it super easy for people to just get off the highway, bypass it, and get back on the highway. You're not raising revenue, and you're really impacting the surrounding communities. So I want you to know that it's something we've totally heard, and there have been discussions with county staff where I think that they've really felt a lot better that our consultant team also had been already sort of sketching out, saying, well, we might have to adjust where the northern point is, the northern and southern termini are, whether you would use ramps. And I'm going to learn a lot about that. I've not gone through that before, but it's critical that you look at design treatments, that you minimize those things, because you can just undermine your objective and then cause a bunch of unintended consequences. So those are the kinds of, that's the reason why you start with this feasibility analysis, identify projects you want to advance, and then you have to dig in and do some of the work. So yesterday, the Policy Advisory Committee made a recommendation, and this was the framework. And I set this framework up for them because I've worked with cities before, and I've worked with elected officials who have to advance a recommendation, and it's a risky, nervous thing if you think that it's going to be misinterpreted. And so it's really important to understand what they recommended, what it means, and what it doesn't mean. Let me just walk through these 5 bits. So the first part is this recommendation context. I know that when I was representing a city, if I was talking to my mayor, and he was on this committee, I'd want to make it clear. We're doing this because the legislature said we have to. We're advisory, we're not the decision maker. This recommendation points, oh, I've got a typo. So anyway, it's a major milestone, but it is not the final decision. What this says is go forward, do more analysis, do more engineering design, do more public outreach before we take the next step. That's what this recommendation does. It says, look closer at these. Items 2 and 3 were the priority. Remember when I showed you out the Policy Advisory Committee in their charter, it said, this is what we want to know from you. Where and what type, and how are you going to do the mitigation strategies? So these are the mitigation strategies that really raise to the top in meetings with the community as well as with the Policy Advisory Committee. And so out of all of those discussions, we came back and we said, we think we're hearing you say that this is what you want to tell the OTC. Improved public transportation and other transportation options are essential strategies for equity and mobility. Not every place around the region has the same available choices. Most places in the country and probably the world, when they put in any kind of pricing, you have to make sure you're providing options, that options are available, because the goal should be to improve mobility the most broadly possible. Some trips don't have flexibility. And that's what we want to do, is provide a good quality, reliable trip for those folks, but also make sure that people who do have some options, who can choose, that we give them options. And part of the discussion here was that these need to be in place. This is what we heard from the PAC yesterday and what we will convey to the OTC. These are things that need to be in place in conjunction with pricing, not afterwards, not as a later fix. Special provisions are needed for environmental justice populations, including low-income communities. And those can be things like discounted toll rates. It could also be things that tie transit use to toll. These are just different examples from other places. We'll specify that later, but other examples are tying the use of transit to discounted tolls or toll credits, making sure that transponders would be available for cash systems for people who don't have bank accounts, that sort of thing. So this was really a priority. And then the other priority, and these are not necessarily in order, these 3 priorities, was about diversion. And that is for Concept E, certainly Oregon City and West Lynn raised those issues in Clackamas County, as well as in the city of Portland, around the Northeast Portland area of that northern terminus around Going Street. But we would have to look at all the terminus points that are identified. Yes?
What is environmental justice?
So environmental justice is a federal determination. There may be people here who can speak to it better than I can. But they include populations like racial minorities that have typically been underrepresented or underserved by federal investments. So people who speak English as a second language, and that came up because we want to make sure that we have a really user-friendly system so that people don't get stuck in a tolled system without being aware of that. Low income is probably the population that we heard the most about in this context, but I think it would also probably include disabled and seniors. It might include seniors. I'm not as astute on those, but that's what that is about. It's really about racial and economic equity would be the more common phrase for what we're looking at for that. It is a strange, when I first heard it, I thought it was a curious, but I imagine there's an interesting history that some people could speak to. So I moved these around in doing this presentation because we used to talk about the concept and then what are the mitigation strategies. Over time, I decided to switch them because I realized everybody's thinking about these things are really bothering them. Because this is what's important. You can't just cause a disproportionate impact on low-income people who are already struggling, who have been displaced by the housing crisis that has pushed folks further away from job centers in some cases. You're going to talk about growth and housing. We're talking about growth as well. This is frankly, traffic is pretty bad here, and it changes the way I travel around, and it probably changes the way you travel around. But if this was it, if this was just going to stay like this, I don't know if we would be looking at congestion pricing. But this whole region is forecast to add another city of Portland. That population level in the next 15 or 20 years. I heard it put that way from somebody in Washington County. That's another city of Portland in the region. So this is about planning for growth, that the status quo isn't going to be enough. So how can we be smart about that and have some tools in place? So these are the priority mitigation strategies. This is, so because we had that meeting yesterday, I didn't update everything, all right? This is a little bit old. But this is what was presented to them in their, to the PAC in their May meeting, was this recommendation that start off looking at the roadway pricing on I-5 and a bridge toll at the Abernethy Bridge. And then concept C, look at a system-wide implementation in phases with comprehensive planning of the system. So that was presented in May. And when we came back, so in the course of that conversation and also others, these are some of the things we hear a lot. Pricing is a great way to generate revenue to add capacity. Or pricing is a great way to manage traffic so you don't have to add capacity. And those are both true. So I want to acknowledge that. Also, some people said, we want to see concept C go forward as a vision and identify some smaller pilot projects to try first, to learn, to see if we can make it work, and then to expand on that. There were quite a few who wanted to see C just go big or go home, kind of, we heard. And then the one that we specifically acted on here is to modify E, because it was Commissioner Savas, I think in particular, who was concerned that by just showing a line right there at that bridge, we weren't really capturing the intention, which is to get a funding. First of all, two intentions. One is the actual design could mean that there's a tolling concept that goes to the south and to the north of that line, but also that it is intended to pay for the reconstruction of the bridge and the added third lane. So it's for the purpose of that third lane reflected in concept D. So we came back with this, where we just modified it. I think this probably works here. Let's see. Anyway. Yeah, so we just added this hashed markings in to reflect that there's a larger project there, the intention of the project. And so yesterday, I don't have the exact count. This was the part of the process that was very confusing. Andrew Thien from the Oregonian called it a tortured word salad. But it's complicated, right? And in the end, we had a strong majority. Really, the question was about phasing and whether people were ready to go forward and say, go with these two. But there were some principles we had heard that we wanted to capture. And one was that we heard quite a bit of, if you're going to put tolling on one freeway, put it on the other freeway too. Do them both so you don't end up with a bunch of diversion onto the other freeway. By the way, not everybody felt that way, including members of the public, but that was a pretty overriding theme. And so both of these do show a treatment on both freeways. In particular, if it was going under the value pricing program where there is currently a freeway and you want to add tolls for the purpose of managing congestion, it does have to go in as a pilot program. And so it would go in with particular performance metrics and reporting requirements and a time where if it doesn't work, you undo it. So some of those things I can't answer for you yet, but I will know very soon. I'm going to become an expert in that maybe. But I know that some of those measures are going to be things like a certain amount of the time that it has to operate at, a threshold. And I think it typically is going to be something like 45 miles an hour is going to be the operating standard that has to be maintained most of the time. So there are really specific standards. And then if it goes for the purpose of revenue, then it has to be really transparent, and that has to be the priority purpose, has to be to fund that project. So I've just been beginning to learn more about those federal programs and what they would require. And they would definitely be also requiring not the same policy advisory committee, but new committees, new engagement and coordination with other agencies. So those were the two priority recommendations that the OTC requested from the PAC. But we heard other things from them. And so we supported that as well as a project team. And we brought this to them yesterday and said, do you want to make this recommendation or this suggestion to the OTC as well? And they did, with a little bit of tweaking, but for the most part, there was a strong interest in saying, you know, it's not enough to just look at I-5 and I-205. You need to look at 84, 405, 26, and 217. This is a whole system. There was no argument about that. We totally agreed. The legislature had directed to start with this. And in the course of doing some of these others, like, for example, that through Concept B through the Rose Quarter, we'll definitely be looking at 405 because you won't be able to, you know, it could have a lot of impacts. But this is really the idea to do comprehensive analysis. Also, that second bullet, as the region grows, we need to plan for adding roadway and public transportation capacity in a pricing environment. So, you know, certainly we heard from folks, it's not enough to just try to, you know, use pricing. You got to add capacity. We're adding all these new people. We're growing. When are we going to get real about growth? But this does actually provide a way. This is one of the reasons for me as an economist that this is exciting, is because it's hard to add capacity and it's expensive to add capacity, not just the construction, but the displacement and the impacts on the surrounding areas. But if we have a pricing environment, you can actually do it in a way that makes sure that you're getting the most out of it when you do add those lanes. So that's a good opportunity that they want to recommend. And finally, revenue. We have certain policy guidance that we know will be binding. We have an Oregon Constitution that restricts the use of state highway funds to roadway uses. And this would be falling under that. Tolling revenues would fall under the state highway fund. So it could not be diverted to non-roadway uses. In the fine points, you get to a little bit of interpretation. Some of it we will need. But for example, I know that the state highway funds can pay for rest areas, because that's a legitimate use. So it's not exactly in the roadway, but for the most part, this is what that would be for. What it doesn't say, and what the committee wanted to recommend to the OTC, is that if you raise the money in this region, it should be spent in this region. And it should not go to spend to the projects in Medford or Banks or some other place. So I'm sure that we could have many months on this topic. But that wasn't the purpose of this group, and so this is actually a lot for the OTC to consider at this stage. And then we invited them all to, I'm going to go back to this. We told them all the members of the PAC, that they can write a letter about their particular nuance, where they differed, where they felt most strongly, what they think about the revenue, and they can include that, and they can send it to us, and we will just attach it. So the OTC will hear directly from each member. We wanted to make sure that members of the Policy Advisory Committee would feel like they can work together as a group without being afraid that they're going to lose their individual voice. So we provided for that. And that's where we ended up yesterday was basically with that. So this is a presentation I put together last week, but this was basically the presentation that they received yesterday. And so we'll be updating it and going to the Oregon Transportation Commission in July. They're having that special meeting I told you about, and you have a flyer there, and so that'll be an opportunity for you to tell the OTC where you think they got it right, where you think they got it wrong, and also to hear the presentation from the facilitator of the group. We'll do the presentation at that meeting. So with that, do you want to moderate the Q&A, or do you want me to just?
Yeah. Well, actually, this mic works.
It does?
And then I can go ahead and just take this one to the person.
Okay.
All right, Mark, over here.
I have two questions for you. First of all, we all understand the concern with the Abernathy Bridge and what it's done from a congestion perspective. But doesn't this also provide us, Oregon City, a barrier for those who may want to enjoy our city? In that, to get here, you're going to have to pay some type of a toll to be able to get into the heart of our city. That's question one. I wonder if maybe the committee addressed any of those kinds of concerns. And the second thing is, if we have a pricing barrier on I-5, don't we just bypass it with all those, especially all the trucks and trailers coming across 205? And I realize that may be a secondary kind of barrier there, but the congestion there is really, really bad as well. So what are you going to do in the interim there?
Thank you. I'm not sure if I understood the second one, but the first one was about, well, you used the word barrier a couple of times as if the pricing itself would be the barrier. And that's not the intention. In fact, I would say that the congestion is a barrier. And I don't know about anybody else here, but I have definitely not gone to certain places. Like, okay, I live in Northeast Portland, and I love Korean food, and it used to be the only place to get good Korean food was Beaverton. And you know what? I eat Korean food only on Saturdays because I wasn't going to go over there on a weeknight. I mean, people make those choices about congestion, and if it gets worse, that's just my example, right? But congestion is a barrier. And one of the things that we looked at that causes the barrier, so first of all, there's the added travel time that's a problem. But then there's also the lack of predictability. That might even be a worse problem. And I participated in a group several years ago where they looked at what people's preferences were. If you could choose between a trip that was always 40 minutes or a trip that was somewhere between 25 and an hour, people would rather go 40 minutes, right? Because that variability is very costly. If you're going to the airport, you always have to be there on time, so you're always going to add that buffer. If you're going to go to work, if you're a lower income person, you are most likely to not be able to afford to be late. If you're working a shift, if you have to punch in, if you have to be part of a construction crew, you can't be late. So it's the lack of reliability. The idea that you would get on a freeway and hope you get there on time just is a luxury that not everybody can afford. That's a barrier. So the cost can also be, and that's where people have a budget of time and money and have to make we all make some sort of a calculation. It will be important to make sure that we don't have that kind of an impact on the local communities. And when we started this, we started with the whole system, so like 26 miles of freeway. And what the OTC asked of the PAC was, what are the most important mitigation strategies for the surrounding communities? And so it's just questions like that. When you're starting with the whole freeway, it's like, where do we begin? Because we're not necessarily doing something at Happy Valley. So maybe what we know we need to do now is as we go forward, it's going to be really important that we look at the impacts on those closest communities. And my hope, it's always hard with the change, but that over time, this should be a benefit. There should be benefits because it should make it a reliable travel time, a reliable trip, a predictable trip. And it's never free, but if the alternative is just to wait and then, constantly add capacity, then you're just doing a really short-term fix. You're still spending money, you're just doing it differently. You're doing it with your gas taxes or your property taxes or something else. And you're still wondering if you're going to get there in time. So a little bit soapboxy from me, but it really is the reason I think this is a promising way to go is in order to provide that predictability of the travel time. I took too long. Can you help me with the second question?
I just wonder if you have the tolling on I-5, you don't have it on 205. Then all the truck traffic simply bypasses 5, and if they're going to come to the Portland metro area anyway, they just take 205 in instead of I-5 so the barrier just becomes the other bridge instead of I-5. Well,
I guess that's why the Policy Advisory Committee, a lot of folks felt like if you do something on one freeway, you should do it on the other. We also expect that we're going to see diversion in both directions. So, for example, I might be able to go to Beaverton more often for Korean food because I can predict what time I'm going to be there instead of just having to clear out a whole night. But for trucks, working in this region in transportation, we would always hear the cost of congestion report and the cost of moving freight and how important that was. And now with congestion, trucks that, trucks that used to be able to do three round trips in a day through this region could now only do 2. You've got a driver that's getting paid between $20 and $40 an hour and he's sitting in traffic. So there's going to be some folks who are going to prefer the time savings. And then there are going to be some who don't, who would say, I feel flexible and I don't want to pay. So We'll have to take a close look at it, but we do know that we expect to see diversion in both directions. You know, the desired diversion and then the undesirable diversion. And so when it comes to that undesirable diversion, where you're causing traffic elsewhere, especially on the local system, we want to make sure that we, first of all, avoid it through smart design and the right pricing structure. And then if it's going to be there, we know if we have to accept some of it, then we will minimize that and then mitigate that by providing options, doing surface street improvements, that kind of thing. So there are ways to deal with those kinds of issues. Those are real ones.
Lynn?
You've been talking about reducing congestion. So did your consultant give you different elasticities for, what that reduction was going to be? For instance, how do you guess? It's all a guess how people are going to respond to this pricing.
So I can tell you a little bit, and I remember you're the economist, and so you're asking about elasticities, and I want to ask you if you're talking about short-term or long-term elasticities, but we could probably take that outside. But I can tell you a little bit about how the analysis was done at this stage. Echo Northwest was our consultant on this project, and they have something called the toll optimization model. And so they start off with an average value of time, which is something that the region uses. So Metro regional government manages a transportation demand model for the whole region where they include jobs and housing location and the transportation infrastructure to do long-range forecasts about overall travel patterns. That's just some background. Based on that, there are some values that are used, and I think there's something like, it's a value of time. It's based on value of time. And the values that are used in this model are something like, for passenger cars, $15 an hour for the off-peak and $20 an hour for the peak period. And then I think it like doubles or something for freight. So there are some metrics that are used that are based on probably surveys that were done a few years ago. So starting with that, they then just do an iterative analysis to minimize the overall cost, whether it be in the time of travel or the out-of-pocket cost. And so they run that analysis for all of the segments. I mean, this is probably gigantic. And then they can make that subject to the constraint of maintaining 45 miles per hour 90% of the time. So it's kind of done like that. It's a rational approach to start, but you would have to look at it much more closely. And very importantly, I love to talk about elasticities of demand, by the way. You have to think about cross elasticities of demand, right? So if the price of pens goes up, I might buy more pencils. Well, if the cost of driving goes up, I might want to take transit. What if there isn't any transit? That's why we get to this level of make sure we have choices available. So it's inherent in it. It's also inherent in the long-term implications of whatever kind of transportation strategies we use. And of course, there are many PhD dissertations to be written on how we do value of time for travel, but there is that. That's the basis for how that was done.
Why did the legislature not look at expanding capacity without tolls?
Well, they did. So there's a project in the Rose Quarter, and there's a project on Highway 217, and then there are other kinds of projects, and as I told you, there's $5.3 billion. But this one they just didn't fund. They didn't fund the project for I-205, and they said, do it this way. I can't tell you why. Somebody here might be able to tell you what they were saying.
That's actually part of my question. It's interesting because process matters, right? And they institute the largest transportation package we've seen in the state of Oregon at $5.3 billion. And as you said, they did a little bit of everything. A little bit of everything but this. Because they used this to drive a conversation and a process that they wanted to see an end result for around congestion pricing. And so I guess my general question is you had two routes to institute this. One was to say we want to fund a project. The other one was to say we want to address congestion. You said if you address congestion, it's a pilot, it doesn't work, it might go away. For the pilot portion of it, not the pilot portion, but the building portion, the project portion. So after you fund our projects, which were excluded from the $5.3 billion project amounts to do a lot of other things, does the pricing go away after the project is funded, and what is the price tag for that?
So I don't know, because we're not at that phase yet. So it's a totally legitimate question, and it's probably one of the next questions to address. But I can tell you that, first of all, we are probably several years away from actually experiencing tolls, because there's so much more to do. And a lot of the question is going to be more about, so what is the viability of this funding? Because, there are a lot of risks involved in that, because that's assuming a 30-year bond, using revenue to secure a 30-year bond. That's the assumption, and I guess that's a kind of typical way for it to happen. So I can tell you that there would be federal policy and state constitutional restrictions on how that revenue could be used, but that's kind of many election cycles away. If you think about 5 to 6 years before it's even in place, and then using a 30-year revenue stream to secure bonding, you're talking about like almost 2 generations. So there's a little bit of me kind of speculating the nature of the questions to come more than giving you an answer.
But you don't know that whether or not the tolling would remain and just fund future projects in other regions, or if that tolling would stop to exist if it was intended to fund this project. I'm just confirming that if you went the route that the tolling was there to replace the bridge and expand a lane capacity, once those projects are completed, I know it takes a long time, but paying those funds back over 30 years takes a long time, but clearly the project won't take 30 years. And so once the projects have been funded, are you saying that because paying it back against the bond would take 30 years, that we would see tolling for 30 years because we add a lane on 205?
Yeah, I think that's that early math, but I think it's not unusual. That's not intended to be a pilot. That's a funding program. That would be, if it does work under Section 129, and that's not certain at this point. Let me just say that if you think that's important, that's what you should tell the OTC. I think this is a good time to tell them. That's a really legitimate thing to say, is that even if this project is paid for, we still think it's important that the revenue, there are different ways people put that. So I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'll just tell you, ways people have said it are things like, the people who are paying are the ones, they should also get the benefit, or it should stay in the region where it's raised, or else things like that. So it's a fair thing to advise the OTC on at this time.
Yeah, I had one quick comment. In your list of freeways, you ought to have 213 there too, because there's 70-75% of the traffic is people traveling through Oregon City, not working here and not living here. So anyway, but that's just a comment. And I realize this was probably outside your charter, but did y'all look at basically cost as a variable? And what I mean by that is that certain assumptions as far as environmental requirements, or maybe the bureaucracy to support some of these projects, where you could cut down costs and change the whole equation of the cost of the project and the duration of it as well.
Those are huge variables that you identified. There's while I've been working at the Region 1 office in downtown on this part of the process, this feasibility analysis, there's another group that's working in our Salem headquarters on the back office operations, determining what kind of technology would be done, how would that, and things I don't really know. We talk regularly, but they're definitely learning about that back office operation. Some of the different options. We're not the first to do this, and so they're definitely learning from other agencies and what they've done. I imagine it's risky for me to speculate, but I'd still do it. One of the big variables in my mind has been, before we even had a recommendation from the PAC, one of the things that was hard was, well, if you, like on the Concept E, the funding strategy, well, if you only go forward with that one, it has to pay all the back office costs. If you go forward with 2, that might make it a lot more affordable and keep more revenue available for the project you're looking for. Those are questions in my mind, so I think that we'll dig into that now that we actually have, subject to OTC direction, we could actually have 2 projects where we could start digging in a little deeper. Right. So actually, that 3rd lane, the legislature did provide some funding to keep that going forward in design. And so there is design work, and my project colleague, Mike Mason, that some of you have been in other meetings where he was with me, and before he came over to work on this project, he was the project planner for that, I-205, so he speaks about it better than I do. We already, I think, are in pretty good shape regarding the environmental impacts of that third lane and reconstruction project. That had already been advanced to a degree, so it's not a big wide open variable. So that part is that what you were talking about, the actual construction of that third lane? Yeah, so that's actually moving forward. Yeah, there was some revenue, and I think they just added a little bit more to keep it moving into the next step of design and engineering analysis. The legislature is committed to getting that done. It's a really big priority. So.
Yeah.
I'm moving around a little bit because with the light there, I don't really know like what the look is on your face.
Sure. Regarding increased capacity via like new, open, unrestricted, untolled lanes, is there an understanding in like a metro region how long the lessening of congestion will last for? Yeah. My understanding is it's like between 4 and 7 years for a given lane.
You know, I recently did a little bit of a literature review on that topic. So there's this thing called induced demand that says if you build it, they will come, kind of. And I think of it as a theory of induced demand, just the way I think of it a theory of gravity. You know, whether I like it or not, I'm not levitating. It will happen. Because people are doing that money and time calculation, and if you just make the trip easier, then they'll move a little further out and have a little bigger yard, and then they'll fill up the freeways. That's just a dynamic that occurs. So this wasn't done by me at ODOT, and it wasn't done by Metro, but I did a quick literature review just a couple years ago, because I was hearing a lot of, we should add a lane here because we've got congestion and that is causing air quality impacts. The congestion is resulting in more greenhouse gas emissions from those idling cars, which kind of makes sense. So the research that we did, and I didn't do it, I asked somebody else to do it. This smart young man working at the city of Portland just did a quick research and found that typically after about 5 years, it does help. It does help right away to get those cars moving, but that within about 5 years, you've lost about 90% of the benefit because you've just filled up again. And that's why it's not about, for me, it's not about being anti-capacity. It's about adding capacity in the smartest way so that you don't just have a 5-year Band-Aid and then the same problem again. That's where pricing could be a real opportunity to extend that benefit period by using pricing as one management strategy.
William and I attended a Clackamas County Business Alliance board meeting some months back when we had a presentation by ODOT. And the question was, once you get the green light to actually go forward with the construction of the third lane of 205, how long would it actually take before cars would be able to access that and use it? And some estimates are up to 10 years. Have you heard any updates or revisions to that?
To the construction of I-205?
Right, actually.
No, I don't think it's a 10-year process for construction, but I think that if you heard.
Well, maybe the entire process.
I think that it might have something to do with if we were to wait for tolling to be available to provide that revenue stream and then do the construction, it might have been something like that. So that's because you've got two big processes. The tolling approval process and implementation process, and then construction. I think what I've heard, casually, I'm not on this project, but I think it's more like a 3 to 4 year construction, and it's just a matter of the funding stream moving forward. But it's a big deal because, of course, if you delay, then the costs might go up. They might go down, but they're more likely to go up. So that's why there's a lot of motivation to not delay.
And I'd be curious here in Oregon City, as you know, we've got the Arch Bridge right next to the I-205, George Abernathy Bridge. And I'm sure the elected officials here in Oregon City are probably analyzing what that congestion might become on Main Street in downtown Oregon City as people try to avoid that toll.
Right. Well, that's exactly why I'm saying that we talked with Clackamas County staff, because it's been Oregon City and West Linn both have that same concern, that if we just were too hasty and just simplistic about it and just threw a toll right across the bridge, yeah, that'd be probably not good. So we're going to have to look at, is there a way to design that makes sure that we aren't just creating an environment where we're encouraging people to get off the freeway. We want to keep freeway trips on the freeway. We'd actually like, yeah, so, you may even find that, the traffic should get better in the local system if the freeway becomes a more reliable route. I would hope so in some places.
And then I'm assuming the toll will be on both sides.
Yes, both directions.
And assuming, again, that you want traffic to be moving at 45 miles an hour, how do you just keep the cars going through?
The price would change.
So is it by an electronic chip?
So there are two different ways. So first of all, there's no toll booths. I hope everybody knows. We don't do toll booths anymore. I was at a toll booth over the weekend because I went up to White Salmon, but no more toll booths. So this would be an electronic transponder that would automatically deduct from an account when you enter and exit. What was the first question, though? I got distracted.
Well, it would be on both sides.
Yeah.
And how do you just
So, okay,
keep
that's
the
right.
traffic moving?
So there are a couple of different ways. First of all, if it was the Section 129 Abernethy Bridge, it doesn't necessarily have to fluctuate with the time of day and the congestion, but I would hope it would, because then you would get more benefit. You'd really be giving people the incentive to consider, an afternoon or a morning trip instead. But there are a couple different ways that it happens when it's really for the purpose of congestion pricing. One is dynamic tolling, where it actually senses what the travel speed is and it just goes up in order to achieve that. And then also you have a schedule. So I think that's a trade-off between more effective is if it just changes automatically. But predictability would just have it on a schedule. And I suspect that for at least the way we did the analysis for the Abernethy Bridge toll, it was just a schedule. But those are just some of the choices to make later in design.
Judith, we're running out of time here, but I want to thank you very much for the presentation and it's a very complicated process, certainly more than, we're just going to start charging people for using the bridge.
Yes.
Understanding that there's two issues. One is the congestion, the other is how do we pay for the construction of the bridge? And to that end, ODOT did make a presentation at a work session for our city commission regarding the construction of that bridge, which I would encourage people to watch because it's more than just adding the lane; it's also adding seismic stability to that bridge, which is an important factor. I did want to make a comment that and it's a kind of a sour grapes, too late for this, and nothing you can do about it. But it is a pity that the legislature in their infinite wisdom did not look from a little higher level and say, listen, why don't we take 213 down, extend it down past Wilsonville and hook into I-5 at Wilsonville, because by eliminating the congestion up there, all that does is put more traffic down onto that Wilsonville and crowd that Wilsonville bridge. So it's a pity that we didn't take just a little larger view on that. But with that said, I think that we've got to do something about the congestion. So, and I appreciate the clarification of a lot of the terms as well.
Sure. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Okay, great, perfect.